Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. You may be seated. Good afternoon, church. As we have come together on this day to remember, reflect, and respond to the legacy of chattel slavery that officially began in this country some 400 years ago, there is a legacy that has been far too overlooked in our remembrances. It is a legacy of faith. Not the faith of those who would enslave, that which has come to be known as slaveholding religion, that about which Frederick Douglass spoke. No. Rather, the legacy that has been far too often overlooked is the legacy of the faith of the enslaved. For here is the thing to know. If we are to speak the truth about the legacy of slavery, then we must know that the enslaved were not passive recipients of the sinful horrors of slavery. No, they acted back. They acted back, resisting any notions that they were non-human, non-thinking, unimaginative brutes without souls, without a connection to God. And so, in acting back, not only did they mastermind ingenious revolts and escapes, but they acted back by forging a cultural legacy of narratives, of prose, of poetry, of music, of dance, and of faith. It is this faith that allowed them to sing with conviction and passion, "Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." This was a faith, though born in the soil of slavery, it was a faith that testified to a God who did not create them or any other human being to be enslaved. This was a faith in a God that was a liberator. It was a faith in a God that would act in history to set them free. So now, the question becomes, from whence did such a faith come? After all, the very vessels which carried them from freedom into slavery bore such names as Jesus, Hope, and Mother of God. Moreover, their enslavers never tired of trying to convince them, even as perhaps they were trying to convince themselves, that slavery was the key to the African salvation. It was the means by which they could come to know Jesus. So whence did such a faith in a liberating God come from? Well, here's the thing to know. The enslaved Africans' first experience with God was not in slavery. They knew God before they were stolen from their lands and made chattel in this country. They met God in Africa. This was a God, a great high God, as is often called, that they knew to be transcendent, which means absolutely free from all human limitations and sinful realities. This God, therefore, was free from whatever their enslaving captors wanted God to be. And as they would soon discover, their great high God sounded a little bit like the God described by the prophet Isaiah, where Isaiah says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts than your thoughts." They knew that their God God's thoughts were higher than the thoughts of their enslavers. And so it was that their African experience was crucial to their understanding of who they were and who God created them to be. Bottom line, they knew God in freedom, and their God knew them in freedom. And so the enslaved Africans knew that their God did not create them to be anything less than sacred, free beings. It was this relationship of faith with their great high God that the enslaved carried with them across the Middle Passage. And it was this belief that allowed them to know that their enslavers were not talking about God at all. And so the enslaved knew that their enslavers knew not their God. And then, somehow, it happened. Somehow, the rocks cried out. For even as their enslavers did all that they could to keep the Bible from the enslaved Africans, and even as much as the enslavers who claimed to be Christian tried to indoctrinate the enslaved with scriptures that seemingly supported slavery, such as Ephesians 6:5, slaves be obedient to them that are your masters, according to flesh with fear and trembling. Somehow, despite the enslavers doing all that they could to convince the enslaved to accept their version of Christianity, somehow the rocks cried out, and the enslaved discovered the God of the Exodus, the God that had set free the Israelites. And so they testified in song, go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell, O Pharaoh, to let my people go. What the enslaved understood and testified to was that God's intention is indeed for all people, including those blessed with ebony grace, to be free to live into the goodness of their divine humanity and sacred dignity. This God of the Exodus was for them nothing less than their great high God. They met that God again on these shores. And then they would discover not the Jesus of slave-holding religion whose names was carved on slave ships, but they discovered a Jesus who identified with their pain, with their struggles, with their very humanity, and hence with their yearning to be free. Poor little Jesus boy, born in a manger, world, treat me so mean, treat you so mean, treat me mean too, they sang. Jesus would say, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. This is the Jesus they met. And so, it was grounded in their African religious heritage that the enslaved Africans discovered the Christianity of Christ. And therefore, as Howard Thurman says, they undertook the redemption of a religion that their master had profaned in their very midst. And so, what does all of this mean for us as we come here today to remember, to reflect, and to respond? When I was a junior in college at Denison University, the alma mater of both Dean Hollerith and myself, I found myself at a crossroads in terms of my faith. Even though I grew up loving the church and loving Jesus, I came to a point where I wondered what Christianity, what Jesus had to do with me as a black person. I wondered what Jesus had to do with all of the ways in which I had encountered and struggled against the daily onslaughts of white racism. I wondered what Jesus had to do with me as a black person as I continually tried to navigate the ongoing and horrid legacies and painful legacies of slavery. I had resolved in my mind that if Christianity could not help me with this reality, then I was more than ready to leave Christianity and its Jesus behind. But then the college chaplain introduced me to a book, A Black Theology of Liberation by James Canon. That book reminded me of the faith that was forged by my enslaved forebears. It reminded me that their faith was not the faith that legitimated the white supremacist ideologies that fostered slavery. It reminded me that their faith was not in a God who enslaves, but was in a God who liberates. It reminded me that their faith was not in a Jesus who carries people into slavery, but was in a Jesus who carries people into freedom. And so, I stand here in this pulpit today as a legacy of the faith of those who refuse to believe in a God that called any human being to be less than who God created them to be. Free, free indeed. And so what does all of this have to do with us? How then are we to respond? As we leave this place of remembrance, reflection, and response, let us leave with the challenge of carrying forth the legacy that is Jesus, the one who came to set the captives free. If we do that, we then carry forward a legacy into the world of a people who were called into faith on the shores of Africa. And if we do that, we carry forth a legacy that will allow us to resist any legacy that is slavery. And then, if we do that, perhaps we can then join our voices with those voices of long ago who said, "Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." Amen.